EVO. Welcome back to The Devil Within, Paradise Lost Redux, Part 2. On the last episode, we talked about Mayor Will Susan's contribution to both the podcast and the television show, how the Tommy Sullivan case landed kind of right in the middle of this national movement, culminating in the PMRC and the parental advisory stickers that we have on our music to this day, Geraldo Rivera's impact on the town, and how most likely Tommy first learned about the power of Satan sitting in the front pew at St. Thomas's Catholic Church in Jefferson. But on today's episode, we're going to talk a little bit more about the investigative side that the police were into, that we covered in episode 2, and that is what was going on with Thomas Sullivan Sr., okay? And is there any chance that he had anything to do with it? He was ultimately cleared by the Jefferson investigation, by the police force there. But there were a lot of questions that people had because, like I say in the podcast, he kind of behaved in what could at best be called poor taste, in that within 6 months he'd moved to Florida, he'd sold the house, he got remarried, and for a lot of people, right or wrong, probably wrong, that cemented in their brains, well, that means he did it. Who gets remarried so quick? And who, listen, I have no idea what that must have been like, what he was going through. To lose a child and your wife. People grieve in different ways, and if that was a way for him to just cut it all loose and put it behind him and move on with his life, can't really blame the guy, okay? But as the investigation unfolded, and this is one of the few spots where the podcast and the TV show kind of do this, so I won't get into it too much until later, but I will say that we take a much harder look at the senior in the television show. So I'll just leave it at that. But you should definitely keep watching. Detective Hart was a dedicated professional, talented, curious, and thorough. Although it would have been incredibly easy to conclude that Tommy was the killer and acted alone, based solely on the evidence collected within 2 hours of the commission of the crime, Detective Hart nonetheless conducted his investigation as he would any other. Yes, the blood smear near the ceiling didn't quite fit the narrative he was piecing together, and the wounds to Tommy's wrist and neck seemed extraordinarily severe to be self-inflicted. But those were questions for the forensics team and medical examiner to answer. His questions were more fundamental. Motive, opportunity, murder weapon. The process of ruling out possible suspects based on alibi or access, until all other possibilities fall away, and left standing in the cold light of discovery was the only person who could have possibly committed the crime. And the answer was Tommy Sullivan. The suicide note spelled it out. Further, the contract with the demon of hell found in the getaway car, together with the Satanic Bible found in the living room, cemented the suspicion that the occult was in some major way the inspiration for the murder-suicide. Did it bother Detective Hart or any of the other investigators that Tommy's dad, Thomas Sr., took his remaining son, Brian, and almost immediately after the funeral, moved to Florida without informing any of the surviving family or the local police? Or that Thomas Sr. was remarried within a year? He did nothing illegal. It just seemed, some would argue, in poor taste. But it did fuel the rumor that it was Thomas Sr. and not young Tommy who actually did the killings. Even investigators had to admit that the two outstanding questions in the case, the blood smear and the exaggerated wounds on Tommy, would be satisfied if indeed Thomas Sr. was involved. But the evidence didn't back it up, and Mr. Sullivan was cleared. As I mentioned in the outro of the last episode, one of I think the single greatest thing that the investigative team making the TV show was able to get was Tommy's notebook and the drawings that he had. And we had forensic experts go over the drawings and interpret the drawings. And we just actually got to see them. And I never did. I'd heard about them and thought about them, probably had fucking nightmares about them, but I hadn't seen them until I show up on the set in New York and they go, hey, look what we have. Here are Tommy's drawings, the actual drawings, and then photocopies so we didn't screw up the real ones. But And to see them and to have them interpreted by a specialist in the occult was mind-blowing. And it really cemented and really brought home how obsessed Tommy had become with this. And just to see those drawings in his own hand really, really landed with me. 14-year-old boys aren't born with a desire to murder their families. Sure, it's a tough age, but come on. This wasn't some flash of anger, I wish you were dead teenage temper tantrum. Tommy wrote about it. He drew pictures. He left a suicide note. He authored a contract between himself and the great demon of hell that called for his life and the lives of his family members.
He had a picture book he liked to draw. I remember this. If you flip through the pages, you would see Mickey Mouse and cartoon characters. And as you flip through, now you're starting to see pentagrams and, pictures of horned men. And all of a sudden you see this transformation of he went from light to dark. And so that was pretty intense to think about, how this kid would go from one extreme to the other. And supposedly he became very obsessed with Satanism, started reading books on it. If I remember right, they found a letter to the greatest demon of hell, and basically saying how he killed his mother, and now he can be in one with the devil and this and that. So that really rocked the church.
But he was just a kid, a child really. So who could be blamed for this? The investigators, after the murder case was closed, received a new mandate. Find out what in the hell happened to Tommy Sullivan in the 6 weeks leading up to the murder. It doesn't seem long enough to bring about the drastic change that so obviously occurred, but in reality, it was a lifetime. Okay, so now we get to where it all started, really, with this class assignment in Tommy's 8th grade history class by a teacher who thought it was a good idea. And I guess it is on paper, it's a good idea. You want to produce graduates with the most well-rounded education, to look beyond where they grew up and to look beyond their own cultures and to look beyond their old religions and their own experiences. That's what makes a well-rounded human in our increasingly global society, right? And so this teacher said, religions of the world. You're all Catholics. You go to a Catholic middle school. Here we go. There's a much larger world out there. Let's figure it out. All right. So everyone pick a religion. Given the media attention surrounding the case, investigators found it increasingly difficult to find any solid leads. People just didn't want to talk about it in any sober, reasonable way. The loudest voices willing to discuss the case were either looking for attention or looking to draw attention to the more fringe ideas regarding the crime. It was the dad, who was now on the run and just waiting for the heat to die down so he could do it again. I mean, he's probably done it before, right? Or it was a classic case of demonic possession, and the church was covering it up like it's covered up so many other scandals over the centuries. But the first real break in the case of why did Tommy Sullivan do this came in the form of Tommy's 8th grade history teacher. At the request of the Archdiocese of New Jersey, we've agreed not to use his real name. So for the purposes of our story, we'll call him Father Brian Kavanaugh. So it came to pass that Father Brian, relying on the worldly instruction of his Jesuit masters, offered to his 8th grade students a Thanksgiving break assignment that would have a terrible and lasting effect on a town, a family, and one boy in particular. The assignment was simple enough, even though at the time it was very controversial to some faculty, and especially to more than a few parents. However, Father Brian's status as a future Jesuit allowed him more room than most to broaden his curriculum, and subsequently, the school supported him. That November at Reverend Brown Middle School saw a promising young teacher introduce a brand new topic to the 8th grade class: religions of the world. This may seem a strange topic for a Catholic school, but not for a Jesuit, and not for a teacher interested in preparing his students for life outside the Catholic stronghold of Morris County, New Jersey. Each student was assigned a different, unfamiliar religion to write a paper on, complete with details and commentary. We can assume all the major religions were covered, from Judaism to Hinduism, Islam to Buddhism, Mormonism, you name it. Unfortunately, there are many, many details we don't know regarding specific assignments. We don't know if the students were assigned religions at random, if they were assigned specifically to each student, or if they could choose their own. What we do know is that Tommy Sullivan was not supposed to do a report on Satanism. And that fact, that the report on Satanism was given to a classmate, is very important, as it introduces a new character to our story. But more on that later. So everyone's going to do a report on a religion that's not Catholicism. And now what we don't know and still haven't really been able to figure out is, were they assigned randomly, which I think is what it was, or did they get to choose what religion? Which I'm less inclined, because, of the whole Reservoir Dogs thing, right? No one gets to choose their own names because everyone wants to be Mr. Black, and then everyone fights over it. So Joe told everyone what their names were. You're Mr. Orange, you're Mr. Pink, you're Mr. White, you're Mr. Blonde. Okay, great. So my guess would be that the teacher said, here's what you're doing, and would just assign them. Maybe the teacher assigned them randomly, but it would be kind of insane to let kids pick their own thing. So, as far as we know, Tommy was supposed to get Mormonism, and this other kid, who I named Lance in the podcast, and that was a big mystery who Lance was, but I think we figured it out. But anyway, some other kid got Satanism. Okay. And they were friends or became friends or were friends to begin with. I think they were already. Again, it's still pretty unclear. But that was, although Tommy had heard about Satanism in church, I'm not sure if he was like, yo, this is for me yet. But then when his friend is writing this paper and Tommy starts learning more about it, he either just completely jettisoned his own assignment and didn't do the paper on Mormonism, or did it and didn't turn it in, or maybe he burned it, but he gets obsessed with this idea from his friend working on the assignment, and really internalizes it more than anyone had ever expected him to do. And so, talking to people, members of the faculty from the middle school from back then, it's seen as a massive error in judgment to have allowed, not the assignment in general. Religions of the world is a noble pursuit, to have a well-rounded understanding of global culture, but for a Catholic school to allow a kid to do a report on Satanism, which was a fringe religion at the time, and it still is, more so back then. The Satanic Bible had only been out for less than 20 years, and to hear administrators, especially the principal, talk about it, she very sorrowfully blames herself. And that was a tough interview to sit in on, and as you saw in episode 2, it still weighs on her that this assignment was able to go forward, and that's what kind of lit the fuse on this explosion of violence and obsession with Tommy. Let's assume for a moment that students were allowed to choose the topics for their papers. That would make sense in that if a student wanted to write about Satanism, he or she would have to lobby the teacher to be allowed to cover so controversial a subject. But that's where things begin to click into place. Events that otherwise would never come to pass suddenly find just the right environment, and poof, they exist. In this case, it was a too progressive for his own good teacher, combined with a curious student who had heard the whispers of a rising fringe movement, and before they knew it, an 8th grade boy was writing a paper on Satanism. But remember, it wasn't Tommy Sullivan. Juvenile records being what they are, we'll never know the name of the boy who wrote that particular paper. Referred to as Juvenile 1 in the police reports. For our purposes, we'll call him Lance. So, Lance. Let's talk about Lance. Of all of the questions and the comments and the calls that I got from friends and acquaintances from Jefferson, it was, Brandon, who the fuck is Lance? I mean, come on, you have to know. And I didn't know. And I still I kind of know. That Thanksgiving, Tommy and Lance became friends. We know very little about Lance, and most of what you'd hear would be speculation. But with a little digging and connecting of dots, we can paint something of a clear picture. There's a very good chance that Lance's family wasn't Catholic. He may in fact have been from one of the handful of Jewish families in the area. That wouldn't have been unheard of. Some parents would rather send their children to any school rather than the local public school. Also, not being Catholic would also fit with his choice of essay topics. Satanism. Yes, it would also fit nicely with a rebellious religious teen raging against what he's been force-fed all his life. Either way, Lance was to write about Satanism, and this would be Tommy's introduction to the dark world of the occult. One of the many things we don't know about Lance is how he was introduced to Satanism, or when his fascination began. Lance had an older sister who was in high school and dated older men, and it's been theorized that it may have been one of those boyfriends who first exposed Lance to the occult. We do know that Lance was also a wrestler, and that he and Tommy became close friends and study partners. On school days, for instance, there was an hour between the end of classes and the start of wrestling practice. In all probability, Lance and Tommy spent that hour together at the library with the rest of the athletes, especially during Thanksgiving break while they worked on their reports. It was after Thanksgiving, when classes resumed, that the friendship grew. Besides sharing an interest in wrestling, Lance is suspected to have represented a way of life that Tommy was unfamiliar with. A level of freedom that wasn't permitted in the Sullivan household, the complete lack of religious devotion, tons of personal time on weekends, and perhaps most attractive, an interest in and access to various materials related to the occult. There were books and other literature, definitely, and maybe information regarding actual satanic rituals in the woods on the edge of town. After all, every kid across 3 counties in North Jersey knew about Clinton Road and the rumors about ghosts and monsters and devil worshippers in the woods. But someone Tommy's age had probably never been there. The investigators for the television show are certain that they figured it out, but not to the point where we could have included it in the show, because it wasn't corroborated. The person's no longer alive, unfortunately, died young, and since we don't have the requisite amount of sources, or that it would withstand legal scrutiny, we weren't allowed to use the person's name. And I'm not either. So, unfortunately, sorry for this to be a great big tease, but I was as surprised as anybody who Lance was, only simply because I'd never even heard the name. And he was a local kid. Never heard who he was. He was my age. And because he went to the private schools his whole life. So I never came across him. So that's one of the mysteries solved. For the most, 90% solved from the podcast. But where one mystery is tied up, another one just kind of expands, and that has to do with the not potential involvement. I was going to say potential involvement of Tom Sullivan Sr. That's not what I'm saying. The new mystery that was expanded in the television show had to do with Tom Sullivan Sr.'s behavior in the decades following the death of his son and his first wife. And how, if back in 88, 89, you were on board with Tom Sr. did it, the new revelations are only going to bolster that belief. But we don't get to them until episodes 3 and 4. So again, that's where the podcast and the TV show diverge a little bit. But it's been a lot of fun revisiting these first 2 episodes. I would do a lot of things differently now if I had a chance to redo the first season. But hey, I'm so grateful for it and for everything that it launched, and it's the foundation of everything that I'm doing now. So I love it and I'm grateful for it, but I just hear the mistakes. So I hope you're enjoying these REDUX revisiting episodes of the first season of The Devil Within. I appreciate the listen. Thank you, and the trip down memory lane for me. Please tune in to MGM Plus for the series Let the Devil In, new episodes every Sunday. And next week, Season 1, Episode 3, A Spellbound Palace. If you're enjoying these episodes, please share them with a friend. Head over to Apple Podcasts or Spotify and rate and review the show. It really helps. And again, Let the Devil In, MGM Plus, every Sunday. Until next time, stay safe out there. The Devil Within is an EVO production, recorded live at Bel Air Studios in Los Angeles, California. For The Devil Within, I'm your writer and host, Brandon Morgan.